Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And welcome, everybody. This is the Keshe American Knowledge Team meeting. And one of the unique characteristics, so what makes this meeting so powerful, is the representation that we have from many different continents. And we've had an extremely difficult week because there's so much going on. And one of the things that all of you can do is in the years down the road is remember what transpired and where you were, because this week was very historic. So I would like you to join me on a trip, and this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We're discussing advanced transmutation. Today's topic is cubic. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is November the 24th of 2024. And this is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. As you can see, it's been a continuation going on 4 years now. And we're trying to condense the knowledge and make it available for the mature knowledge seekers so they can, in their own way, convey the information to the new knowledge seekers. But the new knowledge seekers have to understand that this technology has been around for several decades. And so for many, it's going to be a new experience. And so we have to see what is the best way to convey this information. So the way we're going to do it today is do it with verbal communication, and hopefully add some pretty pictures, because we're on the hesitancy highway and we like pretty pictures because we're in the lowest energy state. And, you know, there's a lot of mess out there, but we can't sweep this under the carpet because there is no carpet to sweep it under. And we have to be careful. We don't want to put the cart before the horse. Hey, where did all these apples come from? There's apples all over the road. So, you know, here we are, and we're looking at the cover of book number 3 as we're searching for outer space. And, you know, we have to look out for those apples on the plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. And why is it such a little pie in the sky? What about the rest of the pie? And is that the problem? It's just a small apple pie. What about the universal pie? And so this is where the future lies. And then Maranteva Keshe has been trying to bring this knowledge forward. And he's done it in the 3 books which have been made public. There are other books. But book number 1 is the Universal Order of Creation of Matter. We're having difficulty understanding that, and we're trying to figure out, well, what does that have to do with my life? What does that have to do with my day-to-day activities? And this is a very good question. And most of us have asked this question when we were in school. And two things happened in school. One, either the teacher couldn't answer the question or the question was answered incorrectly. And this is what we're finding out because in book number 2, the structure of the light, we find that the light goes from one place to another place. And how does it get there? So these are things that we constantly get the answer to that question and say, well, we don't really know. And if we go back to the beginning, we have to make a decision. And so the decision is that the neutron came before the atom. And it also came before the PM tick. And so what is the difference between the PM tick and the neutron and the atom? And so we look at book number 3 and we talk about the origin of the universe. And here we see exactly where 1 becomes 2. And in that process, we've created a sister universe and man's universe. And quite possibly, but not necessarily, the originating universe disintegrates. And so there are two opportunities here to either maintain the neutron field or to dissolve the neutron field. And then we find that there are repercussions that come from that. So what's interesting, of course, is that wherever we go, people don't want to know which country you're from or which city you're from or which state you're from. They're going to ask you which planet you're from. And if you answer anything other than that, they will really look at you as a weirdo. And this is the problem. So what we've been trying for 353 weeks in a row with Rick Crammon and the members of the Universal Council is to convey this message of one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace, because justice and world peace is the ticket to the universal community. And we are part of that universal community. So why have we been restricted? And part of the restriction comes about because of the way we've interpreted the commandments. And it's hard when you're only given 10 commandments to work with, and another 14 commandments are kind of hidden away. And so that's kind of a revelation. And how old were you when you got this revelation? So for me, it was when I was 40 years old. And the problem is that for 40 years, I believed in what I heard, what I read, and what I was told. And the question that we had to ask is, why do we believe it so fervently? And so there's two things that we have to understand. First of all, most of us are not scientists. I certainly wasn't. And so to understand that there's a plasma highway is a novel concept. And to understand that we're on the transmission highway, which involves frequency, we didn't really understand the significance of that. And to us, I mean, that's the only highway that really mattered, isn't it? And then through our teachings, we find there's a transition highway. And in that transition highway, it gives us an opportunity to go in two directions, either to elevate to the transmutation highway or to come back down to the transmission highway. And so we're discussing how we can get to the transmutation highway. What exactly does that mean? And we always have to keep an eye on what is the practical application for this, because, as I said, we're not all scientists. And so what does it mean exactly, and how does it affect our lives? Well, we're starting to find out that it's really affecting our lives because we go through life without asking the important questions, because all we're given is a pie chart of prejudice. And that pie chart is not necessarily an apple pie chart. It's a specific pie chart, which talks about the speed of light and its limits in terms of transmission. But the speed of light has a variable transition. So if there's a variable transition, but a limited transmission, then where is the disconnect? So there has to be some kind of disconnect from the source. And these are questions we never want to ask, because what we're told is that the universe is light years away. So the real question a lot of us ask is, can we have another piece, right? We've got our piece, but we're not satisfied with that piece, so can we have another piece? Okay. And how many pieces are there in the pie? Well, it all depends on how you slice it, isn't it? But how about maybe we have another pie? And so we have to consider these things because we now have choices. And in order to make choices, we have to have a relationship because we have to know what is better or what is worse. And in order to know that, we have to make a comparison. And so what we found through these particular classes that I have been conducting is we find that understanding the difference between transition, transmission, and transmutation alone is not enough. We have to take a relationship into consideration. And so we find that in terms of the transmission, we have a relationship between the X, Y, and Z axis. And in order to elevate to the transition dimension, we have to take all three dimensions. And then we may get to the transmutation dimension, or we may get to an in-between session. And all three dimensions have to go. But do they all have to go at the same time? Since we look at the number of people that we have on this planet, we see the variety. Well, how do we get this incredibly large number of differences which contribute to the variety with only a few choices? In fact, we have a limited number of choices, and those limited number of choices have to do with the basic dimensions of transmission, transition, and transmutation, and the causality of changing these dimensions, whatever dimensions that you want to consider within your relationship. So we have to understand that these are different energy levels. And so if they are different energy levels, then our knowledge is limited to understanding these energy levels. And so our knowledge is not really what we know. Our knowledge is what we're limited to. And so a new vista is opened up for us. We see that there's a field density, a field tensity, a field mass, a field mag-rav relationship. And these are all within energy dimensions. But there's an in-between. There's interdimensional energy relationships. So in other words, we don't have to be all in on the one relationship. And so we see that in our Earth space. But there is something that is common. And this is the point, and primarily the point of today's class. Because we've been talking about surface to volume ratios, and the reason for that is because we talk about the surface of the sphere and compare it to the volume of the sphere. And so we look at the surface of the sphere and we see that it's pi r squared, but the volume of the sphere is pi r cubed. And that's what we're talking about today, is the cube. So we have been used to these feeding dimensions where we do the 1 and 1. And what do we get? We get another feedback dimension. Except that the one-on-one is still there. So if the one-on-one are continuing, and they're continuing to feed, they will continue to feed with respect to the feedback dimension. And so that's a second meaning of the word respect, because one of the reasons that we're stuck in our paradigm is because the respect that we have of our educators and our professors and of the science. Because who are we to question? We are not scientists. But if we learn how to apply this to our basic life, we will actually find that we will have an improvement in the quality of our life, because it will affect our personal life, it'll affect our family life, and our relationships with our children, our neighbors, our community, etc., etc., etc. Because the rules are the same. We're not part of these feeding dimensions or feedback dimensions. We're the observers. And the reason we need to be the observers is because that's how we learn. And that's how we go through all these different dimensions. So we're not in any of these basic 3 dimensions of what we call the cubic. And so we've been fudging our way along. And unfortunately, this has been where the problem lies, because in our efforts to observe what we don't understand, we kind of gloss over, smear, or apply other adjectives to it, but never fully understand it. And we don't have the time and the energy to understand it unless it becomes part of our job. And so we find that the major part of the population that is able to do that as a job, well, they are in academia. And isn't it interesting that academia is providing some of the worst cases of limitations? So we, as the observer, we are actually a participant in what we observe. And since we don't understand it, we have to fudge it. And when we fudge it, then our observation of the environment is kind of tainted. And so we kind of make the environment to suit our observation, never really understanding the manifestation cause. This becomes very important, because when we're looking at the 3 dimensions of the X, Y, and Z axis, we have to understand there's a transfer state and a transition matter. So the transfer state is a dimension, and the transition matter is part of the transition. But if we elevate to a higher level, the same rules apply. And so if we only concern ourselves with a relationship between 2 energy states, again, we're imposing the limitations. So these 2 transfer states are in between these dimensions, these energy states. So are there only 3? Or are there sets of 3? And then do we transfer between sets of 3? And do we have to use a complete set of 3 to transition from one set of three to another set of three? Well, what we have to understand is that the rules also can transfer, but the rules are the same. So when we're talking about changing the energy state, we really have to understand the rules. And unfortunately for us, most of us only understand the rules of the physical state. We didn't know that there's a matter state. And we didn't know that the matter state has a duality. One is the relationship to the physical state, and two is the relationship to the plasma state. So do we have to take that into account if we're only concerned ourselves with the physical state? You could say yes, except that we have another relationship beyond the science of conservation of energy. It's a spiritual science which discusses the conservation of the spirit and the conservation of the soul. And that relationship is even harder to understand because we in the physical state need verification and validation, proof of concept. And the solution rests with the plasma science because it adds to the knowledge. It doesn't negate the scientific knowledge and the spiritual knowledge, but it's a representation of how relationships work. And so what we talk about in the plasma science is the magnetical and gravitational balance. And when it is in balance, it's called a maggrav. But is it always in balance? So we see the conservation of susceptibility. So in order for it to be in balance, and in order for it to have a plasmatic duality, and in order for it to be variable, it has to be independent. And since you're a plasmatic being and you are variable, then you have to be independent. Let me restate that. You have to be independent. This is a universal rule. Because otherwise, you would never graduate from the singularity to the duality. And you need the duality to maintain the balance. And so it's not just a duality on one side of the equation to the other side of the equation, but on each side of the equation, you have the plasmagen state dependency. So the matter-gen state, which has a duality, is a two-way street of equality. So there's no such thing as more equal than. Equal is equal. And it isn't just an equal of one side to the other side, where you have on each side a balance between the magnetical and gravitational relationships. But it's an equality on the transition side between the magnetical and gravitational force fields. But you have different states, energy states, where we have the atomic state, the nanostate, and the GAN state. And so that gives us kind of 3 points of reference here. Two sides of the equation, two sides of the energy state transition levels, and different states. And so the transfer states, of course, are in between. So they're the in-between dimension states. And so when we are in the basic transmission or transition or transmutation dimension state, there is a basic transfer dimension state that will outline that. And so we can now discuss that in this type of class because we've been making the cups of life for 5 years now, going back to 2019. And it involved the nanocoding process, which involved the monatomic science. Okay, well, even if we didn't understand, there was a practical application because it differentiated between the emotional strength and the physical strength. And so we had 2 cups. And when we put these 2 cups together, they actually acted as 1 cup, a combination cup. Individually, it's an emotional cup and a physical cup, but together they acted as the cup of man. And interestingly enough, when we have the twin cup connections, we find that 1 cup and the other cup are 2 emotional cup configurations. And when they connect to each other, they make a twin cup. The application of the twin cup is different from the application of the cup of man. And there are other differences and other connections and other possibilities because there are many cups of GANs. And we can see that we can create, for instance, copper GANs, calcium GANs, carbon GANs, zinc GANs, amino acid and water GANs. And now we find that any GANs radiance can be manifest, everything from gold to exotic nuclear materials. And why not? Because all of these ganses are part of the earth. And so everything that we know in our physical state that is part of the earth is in the periodic table of prejudice. And each of these elements are part of the earth space range details. And what is that range? Well, that range is exclusively in the physical state. And that physical state is part of the matter plasma dimension. So the only part that we seem to recognize is the physical state because we can touch it and see it. But we have to understand that there's a plasmatic state that we cannot touch and cannot see, and it too is part of the matter plasma dimension. So one is the feeding dimension, the plasmatic, and one is the feedback dimension, the physical. And unfortunately, most of us are feedback dominant. And yet, when we look at the principal matter interaction, we find that the universe is full of energy packs, and they're packed in parcels, and they come from all different directions, and they come in all different flavors, and they come in all sorts of different interactions. So we have polar interactions, and we have, for instance, equatorial interactions. And when we're looking at the Earth, we see that it rotates. And so if we look at what we've created from the cups of life, we create the GANs. If we look at the glass from the top, we see that there's a rotating field starting to form in the GANs. And if we look at the carafe on the right, we can see that there's a containment of the glass, but it's transparent. Inside the glass, there's water. Inside the water, there's GANs. And inside the GANs, well, there's a hole. And that hole is also filled with water. Excuse me. So all of these energy states are on Earth. One moment, please. So how is it possible for all of these energy states to be on Earth? So there has to be something that is affecting the susceptibilities for it to be one thing as opposed to another thing. And so we can arrive at the conclusion that something is something and nothing is nothing. So therefore, something is always something as opposed to being something else. And the reason for it to be something else, well, that's your susceptibility, isn't it? So when we're looking at these rotating fields, and a funny thing happens, there's a hole in the GANs. And so we see that on the left-hand side, this is something that is produced on Earth by a non-scientist at home, where you have a rotating field of GANs and a hole in the GANs. And then on the right-hand side, you see exotic scientific cup with the rotating fields of GANs and a hole in the GANs and more GANs in that hole. And this is done in an advanced scientific lab. And here in the side view, you can see how the GANs is pushed up against the side of the glass, and it creates a rotating field. It did that on its own. And then when the water evaporated, look at the beautiful artwork that it created. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And this was done on Earth. We didn't need a special lab. We didn't need a space center. Because you see, we're already in a spacecraft. It's called Earth. And Earth has basically a two-way transmission and a two-way transition because it's part of the principal energy flow. And before we can contain that energy, we have to emit what we are. So there's a connection. And what we are is a manifestation of emotion. Because that's the cause of the principal energy flow, isn't it? And so we have to understand that because there's also a principal interaction with other bodies, for instance, the sun. And so if we look at the relationship of the sun to the earth, and of course, this is not to scale, and so we have a two-way emission of intention. But there's a gap. And what defines that gap? And so we said that it's a covalent bonding connection that binds that gap. And so always we see points of conflict when energies come together. And that is a normal physical reaction, isn't it? But what we have to understand is that this is an opportunity for conflict resolution. Because as these two energy fields come together, we have an opportunity to create a containment and a point of containment. And that point of containment becomes the point of covalent bonding. And this bonding is very important because it's part of the energy binding that we need. And so all of us are responsible for our self-serving energy binding needs. All of us are individually responsible for our energy binding needs. And so if we steal it from others who are also dependent on those energy binding self-serving needs, we are violating the laws of conservation. Because obviously we're getting energy which we use for binding of our self-serving needs. why is that not enough? After all, we were born using those techniques. So, in order to understand those techniques, we have to understand the basic rule of how the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. A lot of us in our physical state, we use the higher strength to eat the weaker strength. But these binding zones develop a tensity, and within that tensity, that zone has a mass. So the way this is bound within that zone. And so we have to convert that energy to a containment density. But where do we contain it? So when we look at the z-axis spheres, we can contain them in many different places. So really, that susceptibility becomes a part of the conservation of energy. So for instance, we can contain energy within a field. And one of those excellent examples that we have is our body. And we contain our body within our skin. And so our skin becomes our physicality. But when we look at the periodic table of elements on the earth, we refer to other types of bonding, where we go from the atomic to the monatomic to the polyatomic to the energetic and then to the creative. So there are rules, and those rules involve conservation, where we can go from point to point or dimension to dimension, axis to axis, or energy state to energy state, or field to field, or matter to matter, or plasma to plasma. But those are not the only limitations, because when we're looking at the greater oneness, we find that there is so much that can be done. And what we like to refer to in the greater oneness is the mathematical relationship between addition and subtraction, multiplication and division. So when we talk about plasma conservation, we can do other relationships, such as matter to plasma. Matter to plasma we call creation. And plasma to matter, well, it's an unfortunate word, but we call it decay, such as nuclear decay. And as we understand it in our basic science, it takes about 25,000 years to fully decay half a life of radioactive material. I guess the other half would be another 25,000 years. So I wonder which half would decay first. But anyway, so, and then there's also a transition from matter to plasma and then back to matter. And that is part of the transmutation. And so this becomes a very exotic way of plasma conservation. But as we understand containment, when we make a field, we like it kind of square. But today we're talking about a cube. Well, what happens beyond the cube? Well, we got into a bubble. And from a bubble, we can get into a field. But does that field have to be square? And what happens when we go beyond the field? Do we get into the plasma? And what kind of containment is there? But then when we look at all these containments, we have to understand that in the physical state, these uncut elements, which we call atomic elements, they have different energy states as well, such as solid, liquid, or gas, which frankly are different energy states. And yet they're all classified as physical states. But what we have to understand is that they have different containments. So a solid doesn't need a container, but a liquid does. It needs a vessel of some sort. And what about a gas? This is where arguments come in, and you're looking at a glass cup. And you say, well, there's nothing in the glass cup. Discounting the fact that there's no liquid, but that liquid has been supplanted by gas. But that's okay. It's just our perception, isn't it? We'll just fudge that a little bit. So we have a basic problem in the physical science is the dogged determination to find the unified field theory. And so, as a brief review, that involves four forces. Well, what we call the strong nuclear forces and the weak nuclear forces, the electromagnetic forces and gravitational forces. And so we try and understand this, how it works. So there are relationships, and those relationships have been guided by the speed of light, which of course we talked about, it's a relationship between time and distance. And so there are two ways that we've relayed that, such as energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. But, we find that the relationship of the speed of light is really energy divided by mass. And then we find that the speed of light involves a relationship between frequency and wavelength. So we could say that the frequency and wavelength squared is equal to the energy divided by mass. So we all remember the mathematician Dino Kraspedon. And so if we are dealing with a square, we have to understand that a square is in a two-dimensional state. So the difference between a square and a cube, of course, is that the cube is in a three-dimensional state. So the question is, if we take a side view of a two-dimension, that must mean it has no dimension in the side view. And then when we look at that side view, we have to question, well, which side is that side view that we're looking at that has no dimension? Because we can go top to bottom, or we can go left to right, or we can flip it on the diagonal. Whichever way you look at the side view, there's no dimension. Well, if there's no dimension, then the square doesn't even exist, does it? And yet, when we look at the transmission, there's a connection that we call a charge. And so we understand that opposite charges attract. And every time there's a bend, there's a negative charge. So in between the bends, in between the points, there's a positive charge. And so we can then transition because we can make another charge connection going through a different path and coming to the same point. Because if we start at one point and it has a negative charge and we want to go to the other point and it has a negative charge, those 2 points cannot come together. So there has to be a connection in between. It's that connection in between that creates the attraction. But as we said, that's only in two dimensions. But when we look at a crystalline structure, we see the crystalline structure is in a cubic containment. Three dimensions. And so when we talked about the containment transition, we go from a crystalline structure, from cubic to spherical, from atomic to monatomic, and this transition is by nanocoating. Okay, so when we look at what Dino Kraspedon says, God is a set of mutually perpendicular lines of force oscillating upon themselves in three dimensions. And since we're none of these three dimensions, then we become the mathematical residue of those three dimensions. And that's not to be disrespectful, it's just to understand that there are multiple fields and there are connections from point to point, and there are grounding connections. So we call these grounding connections the gravitational connections. And so we discussed this before, that when we're looking at a chemical element, and when we talk about hydrogen, although it's called a hydrogen gas, it has a crystalline structure. That crystalline structure is the containment of the hydrogen gas in the physical state. And then when we look at oxygen, it also has a crystalline structure. And the difference between the cubic structure and the hexagonal structure is really just the way the field is rotated. And then these cubic fields come with other variations. So some we call close-packed, some are body-centered, some are face-centered, some are distorted, and some are diamond cubic. But they're all cubic. But there are other crystalline structures. And so when we look at the periodic table of elements, we find that there is a variety. And again, here we are with a difference in variety. And so we can see from this color relationship on this periodic table of elements, we can see where there are similar crystalline structures that come together. These crystalline structures are all part of the physical crystalline structure. And so when we discussed PathLink, we find that the self-serving needs of a binding energy creates a polar vacuum. And the PathLink is a two-way street. So within its self-serving binding, North Pole to the South Pole, but within a combination of two self-serving structures, they can come together and act as one. In other words, we can take the cubics and stack them. So if we look at the connection from point to point, and if we look at the cubic structure and we say that each axis, X, Y, and Z axis, is the same dimension, the moment we stack it, it changes one dimension. And that changes the connection. In other words, the connections have to stretch. Because in the physicality, the connection offers a singular representation. We don't see the individual representation of the two cubics. we see the singular representation of one rectangle, for instance. So now we understand what goes on in the star formation when we maintain these connections and they go in all different directions. And if these star formations are in the physicality and these connections are in the physicality, then they have to be manipulated, stretched, and changed in some way to maintain those points of connections. And the points of connections are determined by the susceptibility, and the susceptibility is determined by the mass, isn't it? And if the mass changes, the energy changes. So when we're looking at the spherical fields, we find that even in our Earth space, we have plasma fields that are overlapping. And we know that because we see the Gans manifestation, and they're all different. And each manifestation is a magrav. And each magrav has a covalent bonding. So these magravs in these fields are the registration books of what is registered within that energy state, within that field. And if it's a field of containment, well, it could be a spherical field. It could be an interacting sphere. Or it could be a combination where we have a singular representation of a connection of two. Where do we see that? Well, let's look at a singularity. And if we look at a magnet, in this case, a circular magnet, and we don't know the polarity, and it doesn't really much matter. What does matter is its relationship to another sphere, to another magnet. But if we compare these two, we can see that there's a huge difference in size. So we can look at the big one, and we don't know the polarity, and our observation is in singularity. We can look at the other one, we don't know the polarity, and we can look at that in singularity. But then, if we create a duality, we still don't know the polarity, but what we do know, when we look at the relationship in the duality, that if they're like poles, they repel, regardless of the size of the field. And if they're opposite poles, they attract, regardless of the size of the field. So let's determine that these are like poles. And let's say that this pole is the red pole. I don't know if the red pole is positive or negative. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that these poles are the same because they repel. And so if we were to take other fields, other magnets, and make sure that they are all red poles, they are all red like poles, and they all repel, then the question becomes, what happens if we have a comparison of a pair of magnets with another? And in order to do that, we have to flip one pole. And so if we do that, then we create an attraction where the red pole and the black pole are attracted to each other. And so that acts as one containment, isn't it? But within that one containment, They're opposite poles. And so to see what would be the reaction of the third magnet to the pair, we find that the red poles, being like poles, would repel. Well, what happens if we take that third magnet and we flip it over and it becomes a black pole? Well, we find that the two black poles would repel. So what happens if we create an alignment of opposite poles? Well, we can create a situation where, again, the red pole would be attracted to the pair and it would be red, black, red. And if we flip the third one around and created a black pole, then the attraction would be red, black, red. Try it. Very interesting experiment. Then, if we want to discover what the polarity is, what we don't see is the sphere. So the question is, if we put a plate on top of the magnet to create a unified field, is there a difference in the polarity? And so we find that if we stack a bunch of magnets who would all have the common polarity, and if one set of magnets was black, we find that they're centered within the core of the larger magnet. And if we flip it around and have the red pole, we find then that's not centered. So there actually is a change in the polarity, even though basically this magnet is in two dimensions. So we see the two dimensions and forget that the magnet has a thickness, which would be the third dimension, but the extension of the third dimension is a field that we cannot see. And the impact that it has on the stacked magnets is whether or not that stack is going to be centered or not centered. And then if we have the centered polarity is black and the not centered polarity is red, then the only way that we can put the two together on the same one is if there's a field attraction going from the center of the core to the periphery of the field. And it isn't dependent on the stacking, it's dependent on the charge. So on the right-hand picture, you can see clearly that the red pole is attracted to the black pole in the large stack and the small stack. And it's well positioned. Why is this significant? Well, because when we're discussing moons and we want to understand the Earth to moon relationship, we say that it's a strong nuclear force. The reason it's a strong nuclear force is because the Earth is pretty big and the moon is pretty big. But this is where we run into a problem. And that is because the Earth is so far away from the moon, it's not that strong. The strong nuclear force is actually a weak nuclear force from our point of view. because the Earth and the Moon are so far away. And guess what? The Sun and the Earth is even farther away. And we still call that a strong nuclear force because, well, the Sun is a lot bigger than the Earth. So now it's a really strong nuclear force. But, from our point of view, it's still a weak nuclear force, isn't it? Because the Sun is so far away and we can't feel it. And so we say that the Sun to the Moon relationship is a weak nuclear force. And the reason for that is because the Moon is a planet of a planet. Because the difference between the Sun and a planet is that the planet rotates around the Sun. But if there's no Sun to rotate around, and it has to rotate around something, and if it rotates around another planet, then it's not a planet, but it's a moon. And so that represents the weak nuclear force. Except if we look at the relationship of repulsion, then we can see that if the large magnet represents the Sun and the red stack represents the Earth, what is the position of the Moon, which is the single red magnet? And so we find that the distance between the Sun and the small red magnet is bigger than the distance between the stacked red magnets and the small red magnet. There's a difference in the repulsion strength. So not only is the Moon attracted to the Earth, but it's repelled from the Earth because like poles repel. And so in order to maintain its nearness and proximity to the Earth, it has to rotate around the Earth. Do we understand that? So the Moon orbits the Earth. But since the Sun is much bigger, then the Sun must have an enormously strong gravitational field force. So by that definition, the small red magnet should be sucked into the Sun, but it's not. It's repelled by the Sun. And in fact, it's repelled more from the Sun than it is from the Earth, which accounts for the change in distance. So this spherical containment, and let's call it now, not just a crystalline structure that we see in our atomic structure, but this spherical containment takes us from that physical cubic to a spherical atomic. But the atomic is cubic, so how does it get to be spherical? It has to be monatomic. So now we have a transition by nanocoating. And then it becomes polyatomic. This is a transition by GANS production. And so we have two different spherical fields coming together, and there is a spherical containment between those two fields. So that becomes a field containment. But how do we transition from that field containment? So we can transition by plasma fields. And so that begs another question. What is the containment of the plasma field? And so the point of this discussion is that the rules that maintain the crystalline structure which are fundamental to the periodic table of elements, which is based on the relationship between the atom, the electron, proton, and neutron, which are within the atomic structure. And they form part of that crystalline structure. And they have these force fields of attraction and repulsion. And they have a similar relationship to what we talked about between the sun, the earth, and the moon. So the size difference between the atomic structure and the planetary structure or the solar system structure is irrelevant to the rules of containment. So the question that we had was if the speed of light is related to the frequency and the wavelength squared times the mass, where does the increase in energy come from? Because if you change the frequency, you'll change the wavelength, so that remains constant. And if we look at the periodic table of elements, we find that the different atomic structures have different mass. So therefore, the light has to have a mass as well. And if the light has to have the mass, and the mass, according to our mathematics, is constant through all the different energy states, then the soul has to have a mass. And so when we look at the intensity of the light, it follows the rules of the inverse square law, which is to say you double the distance, you have the intensity. Or if you want to double the intensity, you have the distance. Well, in the magnetical rules, they follow the inverse cube law. So if you change the relationship between the intensity and the distance, the difference is cubed, not squared. And so this is why we talk about the surface to volume ratio the same way we talk about the perimeter to the area ratio, because the rules are the same. And since we live in a three-dimensional universe, and we're not part of that three dimensions because we're the observer fudgers, then we have to understand that we can go on this earth into our atomic state, which we understand is a Magravs state between the balance of all the periodic table of elements, and then we can go one step beyond into the monatomic state of the nanostate, and then go into the polyatomic state of the GAN state, into the field state of the plasma state. Well, where are the limitations? Well, because we can go even one step beyond. And since it's a two-way street, then we can't look at the Coulomb barrier as a barrier to the plasma fields. We can only look at it as a barrier of our understanding of the physical science. And if we want to transcend the limitations of the physical science, then we have to go one step beyond in that direction. So this is why in the post-Sanya conference era, we can now see that we can actually produce gold the way the earth produces gold. And so when we talk about the law of conservation, we have to take into account the path link and susceptibility. And what are the factors that determine that? Well, these are the magnetical and gravitational field forces. But the magnetical field forces are part of the attention, and the gravitational field forces are part of the retention. So these forces work together and interact to create an emission of intention. So we have to consider nearness and proximity, which affects the bonding of fields contained within their tensity and their mass, which we call the covalent bonding of forces. And so the registration of those forces represent the wishes of the creator. So our plasma fission is shared with the force fields of the creator. And we can go one step beyond being part of the creation, or one step beyond and being part of the decay, but always we are, as part of the Z-axis transmutation, transmission of elemental susceptibility. And so we see that we have quadrants where we can go from the physical state to the plasmatic state. But in order to balance one side to the other, we can go to the left to the right, and we can go all points in between. So this is part of the transmutation process, where the range transition transcends the Z-axis transmutation dimension. So the laws of conservation govern the covalent bonding attributes, and the containment requires a gravitational tensity and mass. But the soul of the man cannot be abandoned. It's all part of the process. And so we have new choices in the post-March 15th era, where we can make a new selection process and to transcend between the bountiful earth space to the transmutation space of outer space, both of which can represent our graceful space of our inner space. And we have the gravitational confirmation of that, because it starts with the hydrogen emission spectrum, which is the physical representation of the fingerprint of the hydrogen in color. And that color is specific to hydrogen, because regardless of where it is in the universe, regardless of the size of the containment, regardless of how the connections are stretched, the rules are the same, which means the cornerstones of science are part of, whether it's nano, pico, GANS, plasma, or the soul cornerstones. All of them are channels for the emission of intention, and all follow the same rules, the same transmission spectrum from the non-visible speed of plasmatic rotation to the speed of the visible transmission spectrums. In other words, the transitions spectrum susceptibility include whether it's a superficiality of the surface of physicality or the internal substance of the plasma substrate. It's always a balance between the gravitational and magnetical field forces, and our physicality only takes into account the electromagnetic spectrum of the visible spectrum. And yet we know the non-visible spectrum exists, because we see that in the magnets. So the point of containment is of plasmatic interaction, but not only, one step beyond as well. Definitely. So, and there are different points. There are different points that affect the transmutation transition. This is why we have this variety in our space show. But the commonality is the pH of peace, regardless of which layer of emission you're discussing. There are many points on the field strength of the dove. And so we're finding that this variety and independence is being exemplified and worked on in the nutrition and wellness transmutation tests that began in November, will continue through December and January. So won't you join us and understand that this is just a basic teaching. The new space plasma research has just begun. So join that team as well. Because you see, when you look at Saturn's hexagon, which is on the North Pole, and the vortex, which is on the South Pole, oh my God, this is really upsetting the apple cart. Because I have a hexagonal containment in a rotating field. How does that work? We'll have to discuss that. We've been doing 565 weeks in a row discussing in the Knowledge Seekers workshops how to transcend the limitations of the matter state nuclear science and bring together the greater oneness of the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute. And one of the beacons and pillars of strength has been lost this week to our physical state. I dedicate this presentation to John Blevin. Thank you for your work, John. And may you have peace wherever you travel. And please don't forget us. We need your help. Thank you so much. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science, so welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There is a world peace treaty and we need to sign it. And that world doesn't just include the Earth space, it includes the outer space as well. So sign it with a pen and sign it with your soul and sign it with true intention. Because man is the reactor of a three-dimensional transcendent universe. And now we see there are no straight lines through field transmutation. And can we go into outer space without a peace dome? Can we transmute through the dimensions of history? You see, the sphere creation and the rules combining the X, Y, and Z axis dimension are all the same, regardless of the field strength. And so here we are upsetting the apple cart of the cubic physical transmission dimensions. So now we all understand why the plasma science needs to be delivered daily via the peace dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. That's the end of the class. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the trip.
Well, thank you for sharing your understanding with us, Alex. Again, I don't think I'm up to your speed on understanding all these things that you're talking about. But again, the conservation of energy is something that I'm trying to understand as well. So would that be something like instead of walking to the store, I take a bus? Or would it be instead of using my voice verbally, would a zero time communication be a conservation of energy? I think it would, but I'm not exactly sure about this conservation of energy, or going to the moon in a rocket, or transmuting to the moon. That would be, to me, a conservation of energy. But that's just the way I'm seeing it at this point. But let's open it up to the participants or guests here and see if there's any questions or if anything has been provoked for someone to raise an issue or a clarification. Anyone?
Hello.
Hello, Fo.
Yes, I have a question for Alex.
Hello.
How come
Fo, I'm not sure if Alex can hear you clearly. You sound like you moved away from your mic.
that microphone mute again? So better?
Alex?
Is it better?
Yeah,
Is it
yeah,
better
it's
that
good.
way?
Yes, it's good that you've raised your voice. Yes, carry on, please.
I have a question for Alex. How comes he said that the soul has mass? I think the soul contains energy and maybe it's surrounded by mass, but the soul has no mass.
So if
Its soul is like a neutron, so it's balanced. And if there is a balance, there can be no difference between magnetic and gravitational because that is what creates mass.
Could I say something here?
Yes, please.
I thought when Mr. Kesh said that the soul has a weight of some sort, because when they apparently they've measured people that were passing on, and in this process, they noticed that when the soul leaves, the weight on the scale lightens. So that must mean it has some sort of weight. Could that be possible, Fo or Alex?
It's like, let's say you have an atom from hydrogen. It's a proton and an electron. They create a plasma. But if you have an atom from deuterium, there is a neutron extra and the weight becomes more because the gravitational is pulling on the magnetical, and that creates a heavier mass. So it's not that the neutron or the soul is the mass, it's the strength of the inner side of the atom, the proton and the electron, that creates the mass. So it's like a planet. If you have an atmosphere, it's created because there is a difference between the magnetical and the gravitational. That creates here on Earth 1,000 hectopascal.
So this is a brilliant question that you've asked, Fo. What I'd like everybody to notice is that this question that has been brought up is not something that you would bring up in a casual conversation.
No, but
In,
like you see, if they give a graphic presentation of a black hole, you always see that the light will go in, light at little mass, but even that goes in because it's balanced by the neutron or the black hole. That means the energy of the mass will go in, but not the mass. The mass is always on the outside of an atom. And a plasma is all that it is. It's like a neutron, a proton, and an electron. And that creates a variance in the mass. That's why helium is heavier than hydrogen. And
so
helium-3 is lighter than helium-4 because of that neutron. But the neutron itself has no mass. It creates a pressure. How do you say it? It creates a pressure on the Coulomb barrier. So there is no room for the matter state to go anywhere, and that creates mass. I can say it any other way.
Oh, no, you're doing a great job. And it's such a difficult question, which is one of the reasons that even in our teachings, when I'm talking about the regular physics, the pursuit of the unified field theory, they don't understand all of this. So what the Mr. Kesh has done is he's taken the strong and weak nuclear forces and demonstrated that they're one and the same. So when you look at the size differential of the spheres that are involved, the principle of the fields of attraction and repulsion remain the same. And that's what I tried to demonstrate today with a simple um, demonstration using magnets. So that they are not different fields, and by identifying these fields as being different field forces, and by giving them a position, it's artificial because it doesn't account for those field forces being present. And when we talk about electromagnetical and gravitational field forces, those are relevant, but the way they're described is in physicality only. And so that physicality that we're trying to represent is not only on our planet Earth, but also within our solar system. And then we try to extend that to the elements that we have on the Earth. And where we run into the limit is to understand that the periodic table of elements also transcend different types of containment. And when those containments have a relationship with an environment, as Faux says, then they have a mass. And so in the in-between state, that mass is converted straight to energy. So the relationship between the energy and the mass is of a different relationship than what is described in Einstein's equation. And the fallacy is immediately visible in the fact that it's mc squared. So right off the bat, it should be mc cubed, if anything at all. However, there's no accounting for the difference in energy and no difference in the mass. There's no accounting for the range on the pH table from 1 to 14. It just happens. We don't know why it happens. And so what we try and do is take it in the physical state, and we say, well, if we want it to be acidic, we add more acid to it. And if we want it to be more alkaline, we add more alkalinity to it. And that's how we change the pH. But how did that pH be created in the first place? So to answer Faux's question specifically, we have a duality with respect to the soul, that the soul becomes part of the containment. And so the containment that we have within our head, within our physicality, is within the field that is created by the circulation of the blood. In other words, the blood circulates around the brain. The blood, however, circulates within the body, and yet it follows the same rules. And so therefore, the containment of the soul of the man is restricted to the brain, and the communication from the brain to the body is delegated to the soul of physicality. And so if we understand that the physicality is a relationship between the duality that is a combination of the soul of the man and the soul of the physicality, so the manifestation of the physicality then has a mass. But that mass, in terms of its environment, is a weight. So then the question, can we take that weight and transfer it to another field? And we can only do that when it's a mass. And so what we've done is we've only looked at the physicality. And so to answer your first question that you asked there, Mark, in terms of conservation of energy, we tend to think of, well, lazy man, how lazy can you be? And so the lazier you are, the more energy you conserve. But that's not what the conservation of energy means. The conservation of energy, the way we look at it, is we take something and something else, and we make something else again. And in that process, we have a product and we have garbage. But when we look at the universe, there is no garbage. When you create something, you also create something else at the same time. And so there is a balance, and this balance is the balance that we call the conservation of energy. And that conservation of energy is in a 3 dimensions. And the conservation of the physical is also in 3 dimensions. But the thing is that we can transcend a set of 3 dimensions from the physical to the matter state, to the plasmatic state. And the reason that we can do that is because without that capability, we would not be able to be born. And without answering that question, and going through life without answering that question is a tragedy. And the case in point with John Blevin, he figured out how to transmute. And so my point is, if he's figured out how to transmute, maybe he can also come back and visit. I hope I answered your question, Fo.
Bo, with any follow-up or something you'd like to add? Again, we all seem to understand this the way we understand it. And this is exactly what Mr. Kesh is saying. It's not what he says anymore. It's how you take what has been said and understand it the way you understand it, as there's no peer review in this process. We're all at different understandings. So if we were to feed plasmatically versus eating the matter state food or the GANs or what you want to call it, is that a conservation of energy since the fields are already, you just absorb them? There's no need for digestion or anything like that. I would think that's a conservation. And again, maybe I'm oversimplifying the matter.
No, the simplification is very important, Mark, because in order for you to absorb energy, you have to give energy first. Now, if you don't give energy, then you're bound to get fatter. So the balance has to come in the emission and absorption of energy. And that balance is the conservation of energy balance.
Okay, thank you. Not that I'm clear on it, but that's okay for now. Let's see if anyone else wants to bring an idea or an issue or a clarification or a question.
Well, Mark, there's a duality. So, and let's take at face value what Mr. Kesh says in terms of 80-20. where 80% of the energy comes through the cosmic rays. So that means we are gathering energy that way. We are absorbing energy that way. But we're also absorbing energy by way of the food that we eat. So the question becomes, is that normal, or is that specific to Earth only? So if we were to examine the basic rules of plasma exchange of energy and compare it to other environments, we would find that, first of all, the rules are the same, but the way we interpret the rules are different. Where on this planet, we believe that accepting energy through that 20% medium is acceptable, because it is not acceptable with the universal community. So are we exclusive in that? Are there any members of the universal community that have the same faults, failings, and weaknesses that we do? And actually, the answer is yes. And how do we know that? And we know that because there is a limitation, not only in our knowledge, but on the application of that knowledge. So is that limitation the wish of the Creator? Is that the limitation part of the wish of your soul? And if you can answer that question truthfully, then you will answer the first question as to whether or not we are part of the universal community, or are we welcome in the universal community, or are we in a prison planet? Back to you, sir.
Well, as Mr. Kesh said, they are eating something in that craft, and they suffer from many of the same conditions that we suffer, and maybe because they're in the matter state in a way. But he did say they suffer from a number of the same conditions. And if they're eating, again, he said eating something, he didn't say what, whether they're absorbing fields or not. But maybe it's an amino acid that they've created that they're consuming. I don't know. But they're eating something. And as I said, they're suffering from very similar conditions that we're suffering from, at least the ones in the craft. Now, maybe other ones that haven't taken on or kept any dimension of physicality are operating a bit differently.
Well, why is it called suffering? If there's a deficiency in terms of the energy that you're getting, if there's a deficiency, then I would say that's a suffering.
Well, this is the way the creation created us, 20% short. And as he said, I think that 40 or 60% is coming from the earth itself. It's not even coming from the universe and the rest. Well, I guess it would be if you want to look at it from the sun to the earth to the inhabitants of the earth. But
Yeah,
we've been purposely, or the creation, the way things came together here, has left us, and maybe it has to do with the wrong streak in the soul that created this planet, to, in a way, as we've heard, to hang on to us, in a way, in this matter state dimension.
well, have you ever well, okay, let's pick on children. Have you ever had, a nice clean house and then have the children come over and come back and find a mess? So you created the organization. So did you create the mess by allowing the children to come in? Or is that a product of the fact that the area that you cleaned up is actually supposed to be messed up? So I think what I'm alluding to is the fact that the free will has a play in the matter. You see, the rules of creating the universe are the same rules that the earth was created by. So the fact that we're operating under a different set of rules than what the universe is operating on has to have a reason. And by refusing to ask for that, what the reason is, doesn't make the problem go away. And by not being allowed to ask the cause of the reason, doesn't make the problem go away, and doesn't nullify the impact of that problem. So the reason it's a problem is because it imparts a limitation, not only on our knowledge, not only on our access to the universal community, but it limits our ability to achieve peace and prosperity on this planet, which begs the question, why does this planet suffer this lack of peace and prosperity? Is it the way it's been designed? Or is it the way it's being used? Back to you.
Right. Again, it's there was a wrong streak in the soul that created this planet, and that's what he's trying to prevent from the same thing carrying on in other solar systems and other creations. Is that to understand it before we go there? Although I guess there'll be some correction to be done as well.
Okay, well, I just have one opposition to your answer there.
Go right ahead.
I believe that the soul of the earth believes it is in heaven. So the soul of the creator of this earth didn't create the deficiency. Didn't, and if that being the case, then the soul of that creator didn't, the soul of the creator who, shall we say, gravitated towards the deficiency was not the creator of the planet. But I would say the conqueror of the planet. Or another word could be the colonizer.
Thank you. Randy, is there a point?
So we're talking about that the soul has any weight.
Come in a little closer, please, Randy.
So we're talking about when the soul leaves the body, if it has any weight. Has anyone ever just what happens to the consciousness of that soul? Does it go with the soul? Where does that go? And how do we weigh that?
The consciousness from that soul expands, so it can expand the whole universe. That's why I say the soul or a black hole has no mass in it. It has emotion. You know how in the universe the black holes are created. Mr. Cash explains it that if two similar forces come together, it can create a black hole. When there is a difference, the stronger beats the weaker, that creates the matter state. Not the matter state with big M, but let's say physical matter, the lower state. That is energy. So energy, like in hydrogen, is always because a proton um, is attracted by electron. How do I say that? It's a proton expands and other receives. That's why it's called an electron. But an electron has the same forces. It all depends on three matters: principal matter, transitional matter, and matter. And in between, there's the energy, like electricity, like, how do you say, light. It's all coming down from the field force energy, the strength of that field. So a soul, it only contains fields, nothing more. In a way, when it expands and it is blocked by another entity, that entity or the soul depends on which is the strongest, gives away his energy to balance out. That's why the creator is existing. And he creates, if there's a difference, and he creates the difference itself. But when there's a difference, he gives. So that is because we are from a lower matter field. And that's why also, depending on where you are, but let's say the Earth, if you are patient enough and you have time enough, the Earth will go back into the sun. Because it attracts by the sun gives it energy, the energy will be balanced in one way or another, so the neutron is the same as in the field from the sun. And the neutron is, in fact, a soul of a matter. And it's only, how do you say that, the physical matter, the lower matter, will be stripped away, not the soul energy of the matter. The soul field is the same. The soul field has the same strength. That's why now the sun gives energy to the earth will grow, but also because there's a surrounding field, it will in a way be, by the gravitational force of the center of the earth, it will be more compact. So the mass will be bigger at some time in the future. But that means there are more neutrons, so that's equal to the soul of, or part of the soul of the sun. And so you can do it with the universe, and you can do it with people, and you can do, but it all depends on magnetical field force, and that they don't have weight. Just like emotions, an emotion don't have weight. The result can be that an emotion creates energy and it becomes weight, but that's different. That's why I couldn't explain the soul has mass. The soul doesn't have mass. The soul of the sun don't have mass. It has fields and certain field strength. So that's why we are bound to the earth. But when you expand your soul, you can go anywhere in the universe. Because the expansion of your soul doesn't create mass. Only when it's confronted with an other entity. May it be a field of a magnetic field or a moon or just where it wants to go.
For those of you who didn't hear, what Fo said was the expansion of the soul doesn't increase the mass.
No, not the soul of the sun. When it goes out, the field creates friction with the environment. That friction creates the light. So just like the sunlight on the earth is of the level of the nitrogen. When the nitrogen comes down in the field force, it creates carbon. And that's part of what the soul does. It creates carbon, and carbon can be, by its environment, can create carbon-14. So on Earth, we have water, so H2. The nitrogen is always coming from the sun and maybe other solar fields. And that feeds the Earth its physicality because that contains a field strength reduction that contains mass. So because there's a difference between what it is and what it will be, that creates a layer. And if it's more like, you go from plasma to gas to liquid to crystallization, and all the other force, all the other elements. So what does plasma contain? Mostly rays. Can be gamma ray, can be beta, alpha, or whatever. Just what they give it the name. But in the end, it's between the magnetical force and the gravitational force. And the gravitational force is so, like, if we say it in hydrogen, the electron is on the outside of the atom. Why? Because it can pick up energies from outside the atom, and it picks up energy of a proton. But there must be equal forces in the proton and electron, the magnetic force, to keep its distance. When a hydrogen atom is diluted, it will, in a way, be depleted from its atmosphere, and then it turns back to fields. That's what in our body also happens. It turns back to fields. That's what in the calcium, the inner structure of the bones, there are hollow spaces, because the spaces contain the field of a certain element. That's why in many medications with cancer, and like a steroid opens the calcium and the energy comes out. But that has in some cases has an advantage, but in most cases, on the long run, it will disable people. Did you understand it all?
I wish you were a little bit clearer, not on your words, but on the transmission, because it's very, for me, I don't know for anyone else, it's very scratchy, and I think you have a lot to add to the knowledge and your understanding of how this all works. But I couldn't hear you clearly.
Oh, it's very.
Yeah. Other times he's been much clearer. I don't know if there's a speaker issue, a wire, a headphone issue, something. It's not
I think it's the internet.
Ah, yeah, right.
But let's not let that detract from the message. The message was phenomenal.
Thank you,
Thank you
folks.
so much.
Okay, I hope I didn't confuse too much.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, we want to leave about 15 minutes for Ode to John Bliven. Again, an ode is just a poem that is meant to be sung. Ed's put some music in the background, and then we'll play the final disclaimer. But let's see if there's any other issues or questions or comments. Nice to see you here, Joseph, as well, and Jefferson. Nikolai, are you still traveling? Or have you landed? I know Selena was here. She probably wanted. Oh, Lisbeth has a mic open. Go right ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you for all you all at the back, everybody, for work with the Keshe family. Only say thank you, the Keshe family for all, and it's not better time for us because John is on the side go, but maybe as one soul we unify with the John Wells, with the Victor Vicente, with the door, with the doctor, I forgot the name, and many other knowledge seekers going first and be part of that totality and be part of that soul of the peace, and of course continue working with us. I apologize for the North American team because I sense a different in at that moment when the Mr. K told us about the going to the John. It's not better time, but it's better time. It's the time. It's the time for continue working as one. Thank you so much. And thank you, John. Maybe listen us. I think it's listen. Listen.
I think that's a good idea. And when I play this ode to John Bliven, let's give to all those who have passed, even if we don't know their names, the soul is familiar. So while we play this 14-minute clip, let's just give from our souls and allow them to take what they need on their journey. Any sort of energies or anything, the souls like that to be thought of and to be given to in a way. And they may need some of that energy. So when I play the final, before the final disclaimer, where you're listening to Mr. Kesh speak about John, let's just, and also John Wells and Dorr, as Elizabeth said, and Sandor, Neil, many people who have moved or passed. Let's just, Fabio and the rest, let's just give from our energies or our emotions in a way to those souls and allow them to take whatever they need.
Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to continue to present in this series. And I support everything that you just said. Let's give from our souls so that they can carry on with the strength that they need.
Mhm. Okay, anyone else before we close? And of course, we have the three wise men, which all the Christians have missed, including myself, which is the understanding of thinking good, speaking good, and acting good. This is something you can, again, practice with yourself and with others. And of course, we also have this other slide that we like to show. And this is the one of being proud of the work you do, and to be proud of the person you are, and to be proud of the difference you're making, because even though we haven't seen a great difference on this planet up to this point, all the fields and the energies are coming together to manifest that change, and we're all part of it. So be proud of the work you do. Be proud that you've been touched by this knowledge of the Keshe Foundation, and be proud that you'll be spreading it to others, not only here on this planet, but probably across the universe. As Mr. Keshe said, he hopes John finds his place of balance and that he's able to elevate the others. And I think that's what it's all about. It's all a process of elevation, I think, and growing. Anyone else have something they'd like to say before I play the ode to John Bliven and the final disclaimer?
To invite the participate in next session, One Planet, One Nation, One Race, and all the time, of course, invite for unified your souls for be part the soul of the peace. Thank you so much.
Okay, again, thank you all for being here. Alex, thank you for your presentation. Fo, for your contributions. Ike, for your questions. Gail, for your questions as well. And everyone else that operated on the silent line of communication. There's no problem there. Thank you, Elizabeth. You don't always have to open your mic, as Mr. Keshe said. A lot of times, a lot of this work is going on the soul level or on the energy level. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for being part of the change, which I think, again, 2025 is going to be even more exciting than 2024 has been. But of course, 2024 is not over yet. So let's see what it brings. But continue to wish for peace, continue to give to the world leaders and religious leaders. As Mr. Keshe said, we have to have governments involved in this process. Otherwise, it won't be seen through. So this is where he said in the last teaching, or one of the world leaders actually said, Mr. Keshe is not, he's a diplomat now. He's not operating as a scientist. So he's been working in the lab, running experiments and tests, developing the technology at the same time, trying to meet with many people to arrange everything in its proper position so we can go to the next step, as we like to say. Thank you all. Have an amazing rest of your day, and make sure I am sharing this properly. And thank you, John, for your time, for your help, and for your service to all communities.